Hey guys, Comic Boom here to talk about comic book speculation because it is time to rant. And I thought I'd kick off the new year by having a little bit of fun, poking fun at myself because I am a comic book speculator as well as a collector. And I find that I live in a constant state of hypocrisy, or at least I'm sort of like the embodiment of a double-edged sword, just like the art of comic book speculation. And I want to go through 9 points, ending with a final point here. And the first one I want to make, and I got bullet points here, and that is the comic book speculation. It is the double-edged sword of an industry desperate to redefine itself. So what is comic book speculation? Well, it is the practice of an extreme minority of comic book buyers who overpay for recently sold comic books, thereby ensuring that the market remains vibrant while fewer and fewer people actually enter the hobby. That is the harsh and sad truth. But here's the thing. That's not entirely true. Now, why did I write it down? Because that's a common perception about comic book speculation that, frankly, part of me really strongly believes in, but I also know from anecdotal evidence, and I'm not an idiot, I read the sales data. There's some evidence that we're getting new people into comic books, but for the most part, I just don't believe it. I don't believe it. I straight up don't believe it. I mean, I know people are out there buying Dog Man for their kids and anything by Riga Tegemeyer or whatever her name is, but those aren't comic books. They really aren't. And if kids, no kid who's going to read Dog Man is going to grow up to read Avengers. You know, I know that's James Tynion's speculation and dream and his wonderful email that he sent us. By the way, thank you, James Tynion the Fourth, for that wonderful email. It took me 3 hours to read your email, James Tynion, but thank you for it. James Tynion gave 3 emails over the Christmas season, over I think the 29th, 30th, and 31st. All very informative, very interesting. And James Tynion mentions a number of things, and part of it is related to comic book speculation. And James Tynion, of course, gave us a lot of comic book speculation with Punchline. I mean, my God, Punchline is a prime example. I mean, here is a Punchline debuts in Batman issue, what was it, 86? Or her first appearance. I think it was the first appearance of Punchline's mouth. The first appearance of Punchline's mouth apparently resulted in this phenomena where people couldn't go to their comic book shop to buy an issue of Batman because it was sold out. But if they wanted to put out $25, they could get the first appearance of Punchline's mouth in pages of Batman. Yay! Now, I don't know about you, but if the character of Punchline was to attract people to buy a Batman comic, imagine how upset they would be walking into a comic book shop, being told by the comic book retailer that they're sold out of Batman, and you really should have started a pull list. You really should start a pull list. Who the hell starts a pull list? Why should you have to open a pull list in order to buy comic books? It's ridiculous. There should be enough comics for everyone inside the comic book shop. Now, I'm well aware. I've been collecting for 40 years, my friends. I know how it works. Sure, I mean, these poor retailers, they got to make a living too. So, okay, make a living then charging $25 for a $3.99 comic book. See how far that gets you. I mean, pretty much most retailers, when they're older, in fact, there's not a lot of older retailers, except for a few like Brian Hibbs online, who are very vocal about everything wrong in the industry and occasionally suing the big two to try to move the industry forward. But we've got no movement in the industry. That's why it's desperately trying to redefine itself. But kudos to the comic book industry in 2020 because, wow, it actually desperately tried to do precisely that. The jury is still out if it will still work. But let's continue on now. The double-edged sword of an industry desperate to redefine itself. Comic book speculation is a force that exists in comic collecting that is unavoidable, and it affects every aspect of the hobby. It cannot be avoided. You ignore speculation at your peril. Now, why do I say you ignore speculation at your peril? Well, maybe that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but not entirely. Because if you ignore comic book speculation and you don't have a pull list, and God forbid there's the first appearance of Stupid Man in the next issue of Batman, and you didn't put Batman on your pull list, you're probably going to have to pay $25 because of the key appearance of Stupid Man, a character that probably you could relate to, but you just don't care about seeing in a comic book, right? That's why you ignore speculation at your peril. So you got to be careful. You got to, I mean, the thing is, that's why people complain about the comic book hobby. It's one of those things where, when you enter the book market, there's no such thing as entering the book market. You want to buy a book, you go to Cole's bookstore, you go to Chapters, you buy a book. You don't feel like you need a PhD to go buy a book. Go to the book section, buy a book in whatever floats your boat, mystery, romance, whatever. But God forbid you want to start collecting comic books. You walk into a comic book shop and oh my God, you're overwhelmed. And then to top it off, you go to buy a book that has a $3.99 price tag on it, only to find that they really want $25 for it. And then you find out that there's 75 varying covers and you can't figure out which cover to get, and you're not even sure which to get. And by the time you're done thinking about it, you actually got to go to the bathroom. And since the bathroom doesn't exist in the comic book shop, you got to go home to take your shit. So that's the frustrating thing about newcomers trying to enter into a comic. It's nuts. It's crazy. It's insane. But hey, let's try to put a positive spin on this, shall we? The double-edged sword of an industry desperate to redefine itself. Yes, the comic book industry. Comic book speculation is the stock market-like practice that brings just as many people into the hobby as it alienates, despite the fact that comic books are a powerful influence on the popularity and creative endeavors in other areas of pop culture like movies and TV streaming. This is what I find to be the most pathetic and disgraceful thing about comic books, while at the same time being the very thing that gives it a reason to exist. Comic books are responsible for the source material for the highest grossing box office movies of all time. Arguably, nothing has a more powerful impact on culture than our movies and our entertainment. Show me what a person watches on TV. Show me what a person loves to watch, and I'll show you who they are. Show me what a society does for its entertainment, what it migrates toward, and I will show you what kind of society that is. And you look at the society we live in. We live in the most narcissistic, stuck-up society in the history of mankind. And how do I know that? Because comic book movies are the highest grossing movies of all time. And you won't find a bigger bunch of narcissistic assholes than a group of superheroes. I mean, look at the CW network. Everybody wants to be a hero. Everybody needs to be a hero. I just want to be a hero. I just want to be a hero. You want to be what? You want to go out? You want to dress up in pajamas, or you want to dress up in spandex and go and save people because you need to satisfy? Isn't that sort of the same thing as buying a truck with big tires on it because you think it's going to define? I mean, look, I collect comics. I've been collecting comic books for 40 years. It's fantastic. I love it. And that probably says a lot about me. I'm an adult boy. But at the same time, you got to wonder, how narcissistic are we that we need to have? It's all wish fulfillment. It's all fantasy. And we love it. And if we love it so much, we'll go and watch it in the movies. But how come the comic book industry is frankly slowly dying on the vine? And you can look at the sales data. Yes, well, we're not dying on the vine. It's sort of hanging on by a thread. But really, when you look at when you look at all the information, the fact is superhero comic books as a medium itself seems to be shrinking somewhat. Now the aspects of comic books that are really starting to catch on are just the independent lines. I like to see that it's expanding and it's bringing more people into the hobby, at least I hope. But at the same time, the fastest growing aspects of our hobby are the young adult line and the children's books, which has been the case, frankly, for decades. But everyone's just ignored the sales data for the last few decades when it comes to children's books, which have always greatly outsold comic books by many a factor. And you only need to look at the book scan numbers to show that. But more and more as we move into the future, the sale of comic books remains somewhat sad. I mean, it's entertaining. I like to we like getting into the hobby because we love those, as speculators, we love those key appearances, right? We love those key appearances. But be honest with yourselves. How many of you out there have actually read the stories? When's the last time we really had a story-driven spec? It's very, very rare. And I always sort of, I make fun of a lot of people. And of course, whenever I'm pointing a finger, I got three pointing back at myself. How many times do we talk about a key appearance and we don't have a clue what the story's about? I mean, the first appearance of Punchline, who actually read the comic? I mean, I did. It's Batman. But hey, there's multiple first appearances in all these indie titles. People talk about how great Department of Truth is. Have you read it? How great Something is Killing the Children, my pick for best comic book of 2020. How many actually read it? Very few. You look at issue, I think it was issue 11 or 12 of Something is Killing the Children. Only 14,000, 15,000 people bought that issue. It's deplorable. Why aren't more people buying comic books? All this hype, all this spec. What? How can there be speculation? How can there be $20 price tag on issue 7 of Something is Killing the Children when less than 15,000 people bought it? That's not very popular. Now you might say, well, that's a low print run. Well, it's a low print run because nobody's ordering it. So if supply has to have some relationship to demand, the demand isn't that great. So why is all this spec on it so great? It kind of makes me wonder. And a lot of this stuff, this is where you lead into the rumors of speculation and everything else. And this leads into another thing here, which we're going to be slowly getting into in a moment. First, we're going to talk about this. Comic book speculation is a practice that allows adult boys like me to justify staying in the hobby that I grew out of 40 years ago. I can now actually do something with those comic books that took up so much space in the various places I have lived during my lifetime. And that is true because now that I am older and wiser, I now have comic books crammed into my loft, which I affectionately call my man cave, or I guess comic man cave. And my comic books are collecting dust up here in boxes as opposed to collecting dust in boxes in a storage facility. I actually just lied. I actually have another storage facility where I store my boxes with my professional legal files. But in any event, all this speculation, I would love to be able to get rid of so many of my comic books. My God, because they're just sort of collecting dust. But I say to myself, who's going to buy them? Well, the great thing is that those of us who engage in comic book speculation we know exactly who's going to buy them. There's a bunch of people on eBay. The problem is that there's a select number, there's a certain very strong minority of what I will call stupid people or idiots and morons who will spend $25 to $50 for a $3.99 comic book. They are there. Now, they seem to have an adverse effect on the market, or rather, should I say, a positive effect on the market. Because isn't it amazing how you can have 80,000 issues or 100,000 issues of Batman are sold in a month, but 17 people on eBay over a span of 7 days will spend $15 buying that $3.99 comic book. And because of those 17 people, the spec and the price of that comic book will rise to what they paid for it. What about the other 99,983 people who paid cover price? Shouldn't that have some bearing on what the price is? Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, well, Comic Boom, you don't know how the comic book market works. You don't know how the stock market works. Well, that's not entirely true. I know a little bit about how the stock market works, and I also know that a lot of the things in the stock market are illegal. And the things that are illegal in the stock market are not illegal in comic book speculation. And that's what makes comic book speculation all the more fun, is because you can really screw people over. It is so easy. All you got to do is get you and 15, 16, 17 of your friends and buy and trade and sell on eBay. And if you get a bunch of retailers together across North America at various locations to sort of hide the fact that it's all artificially induced hype, and you just buy and sell each other's comic books. That's what you do. And it works well. And you can have an agreement through multiple high popular retailers to simply hoard various comic books to create the illusion of scarcity. You create the illusion of scarcity, you draw prices. Now, I am just speculating when I say all this. Is there any evidence other than me just ranting like this? I mean, it is a rant video, so I can do whatever I want. But is there any actual evidence that there's market manipulation like this? Sometimes there is, sometimes there isn't, but for the most part, it's just anecdotal evidence. So the reality is that we're just a bunch of comic collectors. We don't know. We just look at the data on eBay and we draw ridiculous assumptions based on an astonishing low amount of sales data. I absolutely love the Cover Price app, the Cover Price guys over at Cover Price, the hard work that they do. I love the Key Collector app. I love my comic collecting community, but I gotta say, man, basing these artificially inflated prices based on really, if there's like even if there's 200 or 300 sales of a particular comic book in a given week, That's just not really a lot in the general scheme of things when you're looking at literally tens of thousands of these comic books being out there in the market. And it sort of leaves leaves a bad taste in my mouth. I realize we all do it, and all of us have occasionally paid more than we want for a comic book, but all the more reason, guys, you can avoid all that nonsense by just putting the comic books that you know and love, put them on your pull list to avoid overpaying a ridiculous amount for a comic book. Now, not the double-edged sword of an industry desperate to redefine itself. Comic book speculation is a marketing practice that allows artists to more effectively even the playing field with writers in terms of pop culture recognition, usually by contributing to multiple variant covers that are often more popular than the story in the comic itself. Boy, oh boy, is that not the truth. Incidentally, these are all quotes from myself when I was sober. I had to write them down while I was sober. And I'm doing this now, why I'm a little bit cut. Anyways, isn't this the truth? I mean, how many times do we see a fantastic cover? And I mean, look at the Action Comics run of Brian Bendis, which I'm sure nobody is reading. I mean, it's visual diarrhea on the inside with John Romita Jr.'s art. Nobody is buying Bendis's Action Comics run for the story, but people are completionists. And this is one of the interesting things. There are Lucio Perillo has done a lot of variant covers for Action Comics. I mean, can you imagine the difference? You got John Romita Jr. doing the A cover, and you got Lucio Perillo doing the cover B for Action Comics. Well, duh, which one are you going to buy? I mean, my God, obviously you're going to buy the Perillo variant cover. Of course you are. Cover B. Some things just cry out to be obvious here. But it's one of those interesting things that sometimes cover artists really save a comic book. You look at Ta-Nehisi Coates' Captain America run. I'm buying that for the Alex Ross cover. The interior art generally has been mediocre at best. In fact, I couldn't even tell you who the inner artist is because I've not read a story. I got it purely for the Alex Ross covers, just like I'm getting the Immortal Hulk for the Alex Ross covers. The exception with the Immortal Hulk is that Al Ewing is writing a great story. I'm actually reading the story in the Immortal Hulk because the story is just as good on the Alex Ross art on the outside. But isn't it interesting that comic book speculation can result in a situation where it sort of evens the playing field, that a really good artist can make up for a terrible written story? And that seems to happen more often than not, a disturbing number of times, actually. And that's one of the things that's a little bit sad. And I wish there was more story-driven spec. I wish that my fellow YouTubers out there, when they talk about speculation, I wish they would talk more about what has actually happened in the comic book to give the writers some credit, other than just Donny Cates. All right, now another comic book speculation, another one of my quotes. Wow, a marketing practice that allows collectors with no talent whatsoever in any other area of what constitute a life in any multiverse to claim that they know what the F they are talking about when the subject of the first appearance of Hoarder Man comes up at the dinner table. And incidentally, it's in I Need More Room for My Comics, issue 1. All right. This pretty much sums things up. And this is actually, I say this is a double-edged sword because this is also one of the good things. Because, you know, guys like me, I mean, we all work for a living, and it's really nice to know that all this useless information that I thought was totally useless about comic books growing up. I mean, I'm 52 years old, and I can tell you about the first appearance of, Nobody Man issue, what that is, and the first issue of Harley Quinn, and the first issue of Batman, the first appearance of Punchline. I mean, who knows this? What grown adult cares about this stuff? Well, apparently I do. So I am literally filled. I am brimming with absolutely useless information. So you can imagine my pleasant surprise when I go on YouTube and I find out there's actually a surprising amount of people who care about useless information and actually engage in speculation and force new people who come to this hobby to pay $25 for a $3.99 comic book. Man, it's so great to find like-minded people. Let's continue. All right. Comic book speculation is the practice of studying the rumor and the news, and especially the sales data. The market is what determines the dollar value of a comic, not your opinion. It's the collective views of the entire marketplace expressed through confirmed purchases on eBay, Instagram, and other platforms that determines the dollar value at any one time. Yes, This was stated so articulately by myself, I had to write it down, and so I did. Yeah, your opinion just doesn't matter, people. It just doesn't. Mine doesn't matter. It's the collective opinion of the marketplace. For the life of me, I don't understand why the 6-issue Naomi series is popular. I think it's a very mediocre story. I think the art's fantastic, but I don't understand the popularity of Naomi. I don't. But my opinion's not relevant. My opinion's only relevant for the comic books that I want to buy, right? Now, I did buy Naomi because I was curious, but also because I'm a speculator. And that's sort of the double-edged sword of being a speculator, is that I end up buying comic books that I may not like because I'm speculating. And it's the first appearance of Naomi, and I gotta buy for the first appearance of Naomi, and I did buy. The first #1 came out, I got the key issue. But then a stupid thing happened. All of a sudden it shot up to $25 in less than a week. Why? I don't know why. It's because everybody else who bought it, apparently, there was 17 or 18 people out there in the first week that were stupid enough to pay $25 for a comic that came out less than 7 days before for cover price. And so now suddenly I got to complete the series because idiots think it's popular when really it isn't. Nobody's talking about Naomi. Nobody is. Young Justice sucked. Are we ever going to get volume 2 of Naomi? Probably not. But there's going to be a movie. There's going to be TV streaming about it. We talked about that earlier. Comic books are connected to pulp culture in a way that other things are not. Nobody really knows a lot about comic books other than those of us in this niche little hobby we're in. And yet, it's amazing how much power and influence comic books actually have behind the scenes. The power that they have to inspire all this TV streaming, TV shows, movies. It's kind of interesting stuff. But at the same time, I gotta say, when you're sitting down and you're right in the middle of this hobby and you're collecting all this stuff, it can get a little frustrating sometimes because you're forced to buy crap that you don't really like. And it's not to say that it's even crap. It's just stuff that I personally don't like. Because that leads into rule #1, which eventually we're going to get to, and that is, of course, buy what you love. The problem with comic book speculation is that the more I get into comic book speculation, and I've known this for years, is that it often at times forces and pushes you into areas that you don't want to go because you're thinking about the dollar signs and you're thinking about the value as opposed to why you got into the hobby in the first place, to buy what you love. And there's always that temptation to abandon what you love to engage in comic book speculation. And in that sense, that's not always a good thing. Now, this leads into this. Beware of groupthink. Good Lord, if everybody is aware of the same rumor and news and specking on the same comic, on the same character, based upon the same movie or the same movie, it is not necessarily the case that it will have value beyond the short-term hype. I have said this before, and I'll say it again. You do so at your own peril. I said it earlier, and I meant it. Comic book speculation, remember, it's supposed to be fun, guys. Have fun doing it. But just remember, I mean, look, remember what happened in the 90s. Well, most of you can't because you weren't even born then, but whatever. You talk to your parents. I can tell you, having lived through the 90s, the 90s, fortunately in the 90s, I was basically in law school. So through most of the 90s, that was my university life. I graduated in '87. I had a fun time in university. And so I didn't have a lot. Most of my money was spent in pubs and taverns and books and tuition as opposed to comic books. So I very fortunately missed out on all that comic. I still collected comics in the 90s, but fortunately I didn't end up losing my shirt like a lot of people did. I knew that these comic books were not going to be worth more in the 90s. In the 90s, I knew it was hype in the 90s. I knew back then. Comic collectors knew back then. The numbers spoke for themselves. And I'm not saying that I'm not saying that with 2020 vision. I'm being serious. Most retailers knew. There were people that were opening up comic shops in the 90s. They were doing it to get in on the hype. There were people selling comic books out of trucks. They were getting licensed to sell comic books. They were getting they opened up diamond accounts just to sell comic books out of a pickup truck, some of them, just to get in on the action and to make a quick buck. And of course, surprise, surprise, the market bottomed out. This is to surprise of absolutely no one. Now, that's not what is happening today. Right now, in today's, especially now in 2020, people are legitimately making purchases. There are confirmed purchases on eBay of people spending a lot of money on some very relatively new comic books, particularly Bronze Age, which I find absolutely shocking. It makes me openly wonder if a lot of the marketplace or these new investors are maybe just guys with disposable income that aren't particularly knowledgeable about the actual value of these comic books, because I think that they're artificially creating hype where there is none. The first appearance of Miles Morales, that previews in issue number 95, that is an extreme example of abject stupidity. Yet, you talk to the guy who paid, well, I think he paid $9,500 for it. He thinks that it's, even though it's not a comic book, it's just an advertisement, which I think disqualifies it automatically. Not in his eyes. In his eyes, he says, well, there's very few of these in high grade because they always threw them out. To which I respond, so what? People threw them out. People threw them out. What do garbage and people throwing stuff out have in common? They're both thrown out, and they're both in fact garbage. So it has no value. That's a mistake. But remember, now this guy wants to create groupthink. He wants more and more people to think that the first appearance of Miles Morales is in Previews 95. He wants to create groupthink. Because as long as you get a certain number of people believing nonsense, more and more people will believe it. Well, please think for yourself. You can think whatever you want about the first appearance of Miles Morales, but just keep in mind some tether to reality, please. Now, there are two types of people in modern comic collecting. The first is the person who thinks every comic he comes across is a potential retirement income. Like the guy who bought Miles Morales' first appearance, previews number 95. And the second is the one who has no idea that people exist who will pay $25 for a comic book that came out last week for $3.99. That does not make either person's opinion right or wrong or vice versa. What it does mean is that two people viewing the same thing can view it very, very differently. And that basically ultimately is the lesson here and the moral, and that is respect each other's point of view. We can disagree with each other on what the value of a particular comic book is, and in fact, it's that difference of opinion that keeps our hobby alive and well and vibrant, and hopefully less likely to die than I fear sometimes it might be doing. But be nice to each other out there. Be respectful, and guys, if you do happen to want to start and get into this hobby, and if you don't have a pull list, get into it. Keep an eye on movies, on news. Make up your own opinion. Look at the sales data. Subscribe to Key Collector app or the Cover Price app, or watch YouTube videos, whether it's me or any other group of YouTubers out there. There's so many knowledgeable people out there. Enjoy it. Heck, hit the subscribe button while you're at it. Have some fun. But finally, the number one rule is to collect what you love. That's what it is. If you collect what you love, it will always have value. When I talked about value in this little rant I was on, I'm really talking about marketing, monetary value. But now when I talk about value, I mean personal value to you, emotional value. I still remember my first series of comic books. It isn't one particular comic book that stands out in my mind. It's a series of comic books, all related to Superboy and the Legion of Superheroes. I still have those comic books, and they're in terrible condition because I read them. I read them because I love them. And I wouldn't sell them for $1,000 because every time I look at them, they make me feel like the little boy I still am in my heart. And I guess because I've always collected comic books, maybe I'm just an adult boy, and maybe I'll always have some growing up to do. So be it. But sometimes one of the things that bothers me about comic book speculation is that comic books in many ways, it's lost its innocence. Gone are the days where you could go and really go through a dollar bin anymore and really find a gem. I mean, you still can, but it's just not the same anymore. Retailers are more knowledgeable now about what has value and what isn't than ever before. There seems to be a growing groupthink that we all seem to have the collective one mind mentality as to what has value and what doesn't. And it's getting increasingly more difficult to find actual story-driven spec, where it's the quality of the story that drives the popularity of the comic book, as opposed to a random, useless, pathetic first appearance of a character that nobody cares about, but because if it's a first appearance, some retailers will just slap a $10 price tag on it with no rhyme or reason whatsoever. At the end of the day, guys, it might be frustrating, but remember that nothing has any value or any meaning except the value that you give it. And so if you don't think a comic book is worth what anybody else tells you it is, that's because it isn't. And I know that because you're not prepared to pay that for it. And if you're not prepared to pay that for it, it's not worth it. So don't. It isn't rocket science. Guys, that's my rant. Until next time, hit the subscribe button. Follow me on Twitter at Metropolis40. Enjoy some comic collecting. Remember to get a pull list. And until next time, Comic Boom out.